Hello, I'm Samantha Nystrom, a PhD candidate at the University of Delaware. My dissertation in English literature focused on the role of the garden in the long 19th century novel. An article derived from this dissertation is forthcoming in Studies in Romanticism Spring 2022 issue. Today, I'll be talking about how the garden affords sexual violence against women as depicted in Francis Burney's Evelina. Lost in the dark walks at Vauxhall on Tuesday 24th instant, two female reputations. One of them had a small spot occasioned by some dirt thrown upon it last week in the road to Lavrali. The other never soiled. Whoever will bring them back to the owners shall receive £5,000 with thanks. This product advertisement for lost items suggests that a woman's reputation in the 18th and 19th centuries was as easily discarded as a coat. It was infinitely harder to return. The £5,000 reward offered exposes the near possibility of returning a woman's reputation. Consider that the annual salary of the First Lord of the Treasury was £4,000 around this period. Many reputations were destroyed in pleasure gardens like Vauxhall, shown on screen, as they were locations frequented by society during the 18th and 19th centuries. Pleasure gardens of the Romantic period were, as Amy King puts it, quote, part urban green spaces, part amusement parks, unquote. Significantly, these gardens' formal elements permitted violent revelry. The dark walks with their unilluminated pathways and high hedges were notorious for licensing sexual acts. Such illicit acts occurred so frequently that Vauxhall's proprietor boarded up such walks and placed more illuminations in the garden itself in the mid-18th century. These efforts were in vain, however, as 150 young men tore down the barriers and lights, which were not reinstalled. For many, removing danger removed these gardens' appealing qualities. Patrons and proprietors alike acknowledged that Vauxhall and other pleasure gardens were socially accepted sites of immorality. Depictions of such immorality spanned from 18th century literature to contemporary media. Another of Frances Burney's novels, her 1782 Cecilia, depicts the character committing suicide at Vauxhall. William Thackeray's 1848 Vanity Fair also showcases the drunkenness encouraged by the garden's milieu. This novel sets a pivotal scene where one rich, drunk male character is on the precipice of proposing to the novel's poor anti-heroine Becky Sharp in the pleasure garden, showcasing how such gardens blur boundaries of class and morality. ITV's adaptation highlights this scene, a still from which you can see on the left. Contemporary shows evoke the danger of such pleasure gardens as well. In Netflix's blockbuster miniseries Bridgerton, the main character is isolated in an unnamed pleasure garden and sexually assaulted by a prospective suitor, as shown in the screen. Not only does the seclusion that the garden provides enable this man to attempt his assault, but the isolation such garden affords ensures that the show's heroine and hero can concoct the fake marriage scheme that fuels the rest of the series' plot. Such pleasure gardens licensed revelry, violence, and morality and became touchstone settings for creators, past and present, to set scenes of vice and danger. Yet, such danger did not influence everyone equally. Central conceit of this talk is that during the Romantic century, gardens were often dangerous places for women. And while in this talk I'm only focusing on pleasure gardens, which were commercial spaces very different from the more private domestic gardens, I'd be happy in a Q&A or email to talk about violence in other forms of gardens as well. While gardens could regularly serve as places of refuge, of education and artistry, professional labor, and of fantasizing new ways of life, literary scholars have yet to explore what affords the garden in depth: its facilitation of violence against women. As a semi-public place, individuals could either receive public scorn or protection against assault. As a semi-private space, gardens could either provide refuge from unwanted spectators when conducting personal actions, or even aid from arriving when in danger. This shift in public and private, seen and unseen, could engender refuge or harm for garden goers. I argue that the garden often encouraged violence against women, as other garden goers drew upon the garden's oscillation between public and private to create harm. While vulnerable women could have drawn upon the public nature of an estate garden for protection, anyone looking to attack her could simply wait till she encountered a grove of trees to launch their assault. This public place would quickly transform into a private one. While this setting's capacity to permit violence is not directly visible, no guillotine-like object hangs over the garden, indicating such a ready danger. When entering the garden, women were often sexually and or socially threatened. In this talk, I use the term violence to mean sexual violence against women, such as harassment, humiliation, assault, and attempted rape. While legal recognition of sexual violence was limited during my period of study, I follow in the path of Anne Greenfield's Edith collection, Interpreting Sexual Violence 1600 to 1800, which, quote, adopts an intentionally modern and therefore inclusive scope, examining a wide variety of sexually violent acts, many of which would not have been grouped together by writers and thinkers during this era, unquote. To make visible how the garden affords such violence, Critics must use these phrasing, step back, and perceive the contours of the background which generate such outbursts. Looking at the background, a garden's structural design allows critics to better understand how these places could become violent localities for their female users. I neither mean to suggest that violence was the only experience a woman could have in a garden, nor that all gardens were inherently violent. Rather, by examining Frances Burney, here I briefly explore how violence was a common experience for women in gardens by interrogating how they afforded violent outbursts. Literature enables critics to see how gardens permit such violence, as it can narrativize trauma in ways that historical records often cannot. For instance, while designs, like the one by Warwick Worth of Vauxhall shown on screen, show the layout of a garden, they do not often reveal how gardens were used after their creation. Designs reveal the garden's implied visitor, to use garden historian John DeSoon Hutt's phrase. The implied visitor is who the designer imagined interacting with and using their garden. Yet gardens' actual visitors would often deviate from this imagined one. Within the recorded garden visits critics have access to, what experiences get recorded are often quite selective. Sexual assault and its resulting trauma are often written out of historical record due to a combination of an unsympathetic judicial system, willful ignorance, psychological repression, patriarchal norms, and general misogyny. Literature brings to light experiences that are often recorded elsewhere. Here, the sexual violence in the garden can get recorded. Evelina illuminates such experiences, for its narrative is steeped with gendered violence, violence spurred on by its gardens. Notice how this older copy of Evelina uses Tom and Valance's image from Vauxhall for its cover. This novel centers on its titular character's coming of age and is filled with scenes of her attempting to navigate 18th century social norms. After many social foibles and true dangers, she eventually reunites with her biological father and marries Lord Orville, her suitor throughout the novel. Evelina's social encounters are consistently set in pleasure gardens, a setting that continually emphasizes the social and sexual precarity she's within until her marriage. In what follows, I examine how women's social identity was built around navigating sexual and social violence afforded by the garden structure. I turn to one later depiction of women walking through the garden to examine how its oscillation between public and private is used by other garden goers to conduct women into violent scenarios. One of the most dangerous places for women to walk during this period, as Evelina learns, were pleasure gardens like Vauxhall. Upon entering Vauxhall, guests like Evelina were soon ushered into its grand walks, as depicted on screen. When walking along these pathways, garden goers could encounter the orchestra stand. Here guests could mingle and listen to music ranging from full bands to solitary fiddlers to singers performing comic songs. If they became hungry, guests could eat, drink, and rest in supper boxes. When satiated, guests could enjoy ornamental sights like the Chinese pavilion, triumphal arches, faux ruins, statuaries, and hermitages. Moreover, they could view the evening's performance acts, whether they be fireworks, fire performers, or tightrope walkers like Madame Sequy. Furthermore, they could dance with fellow patrons. Once darkness truly took over, lamps would illuminate all but the dark walks. If one wanted privacy to escape unwanted attention, there were a plethora of pathways and alcoves a guest could hide within. The trees, for instance, lining the pathway in this figure, provided seclusion from other guests. What made Vauxhall unique was its combination of entertainments. It was not just an outdoor space, but a concert hall, food hall, art gallery, and performance center. Despite all these entertaining features, fellow guests were the most prominent source of amusement. As Peter Brisset notes, quote, "For those seeking social and sexual status, walks and gardens were among the key auditoriums from which to observe and stages on which to perform," unquote. Seeing and being seen were the main event. Guests used the pleasure garden structure, its walks and bandstands, for instance, to engage with other guests. Pleasure gardens afforded circular movement rather than, quote, progressing from point A to point B. When the company moved, they were effectively going nowhere, unquote, as they remained within the confines of the garden. As fellow garden goers were the main spectacle, guests promenaded in this non-progressive way to observe others. The various entertainments and garden structures provided resting and gathering points for this non-progressive movement. Burney's Evelina narrativizes how guests become part of this entertainment, specifically how women transform into objects to amuse male guests. Considering Vauxhall end of season, one of Evelina's cousins, Mr. Branton, observes that it is the best night of any. There's always a riot. And there the folks run about. And then there's such a squealing and squalling. And there all the lamps are broke and the women run skimper scamper. I declare I would not take 5 guineas to miss that last night. For Branton, women become sources of entertainment meant to be gazed upon by male guests. Using skipper and scamper to describe a response to this riotous violence dismisses the very real danger women would most likely feel when surrounded by male aggression. Such aggression was afforded by the garden itself. Put differently, the ability to control female movement was ingrained within such pleasure gardens. The nooks, crannies, and pathway figures depict not only The nooks, crannies, and pathways this figure depicts not only enable guests to find privacy, but also enable guests to isolate themselves with others, whether both parties were consenting or not. The pleasure garden's characteristic circular movement, along with the predetermined sites to stop, rest, and mingle with other guests, ensured that most knew where other guests were heading. Male guests who knew the layout of the garden afforded them the opportunity to physically overpower women, such as the case when Mr. Smith, Mr. Branton's lodger, grabs Evelina, quote, hand, and with a motion too quick to be resisted, ran away with me many yards before I had the breath to ask his meaning, though I struggled as well as I could to get from him, unquote. Under the guise of bringing Evelina to see the cascade, Mr. Smith expertly controls her bodily autonomy. Gripping her hand so it cannot be resisted, Smith physically maneuvers Evelina's body so she is forced to follow his lead. Yet within Evelina, the joy of empowering a female guest, such structural allowance of sexual violence is best seen in the dark walks. First, the structural confinement of the dark walks, trees, and hedges enable male guests to entrap female guests in Evelina. Upon her first visit to Vauxhall, Evelina gets lost among the unlit pathways, running into groups of men that use the confining and confusing nature of these paths to overpower her. Upon first getting lost, a large party of gentlemen, apparently very riotous, and who were hallooing, leaning on one another, and laughing immoderately, seemed to rush suddenly from behind some trees, and meeting us face to face, put their arms at their sides, and formed a kind of circle that first stopped our proceeding, and then our retreating, for we were presently entirely enclosed. Our screams were answered with bursts of laughter, and for some minutes we were kept prisoners. Using the trees that comprised the walks to hide their position, the gentlemen cornered Evelina and our female companion. The garden transformed from a place of leisure into one of confinement, as Evelina feels like a prisoner. The men and trees serve as prison walls, ensuring that women lose their freedom of movement. The darkness, the height of trees, and the lack of signage all contribute to Evelina's imprisoned feelings, and all are mobilized by these riotous men to entrap her. Second, manipulating light, garden goers rapidly transform the garden into a site of danger for Evelina. Pleasure gardens were not evenly illuminated. The still from ITV's adaptation of Vanity Fair does a good job depicting the lack of illumination much of the garden. Breaking free from her first prison, Evelina attempts to reach illuminated walkways and the safety they promise. Yet she's prevented by a second group of men who halt her movement by directly standing between her and the lighted pathways. One guest grabs her hand and makes her race up and down the pathway with him. Making her run on command, this man strips Evelina of her physical agency and objectifies her, turning her into a figure for his aesthetic enjoyment. While such advances, quote, almost distracted Evelina with terror, unquote, for the male guest, this was a moment to play. She transformed into a plaything in this unlit pathway. By playing with heightened light, male garden patrons create a sense of danger for Evelina by secluding her away from the safety of the public eye. When detailing Evelina's final assault within the dark walks, the narrative explicitly comments upon the danger arising when the garden moves between public and private. Coming upon Evelina after these previous assaults, Sir Clement, a London acquaintance, is initially cast as a savior. Recognizing Evelina's danger, he pulls her away from such threats. He does not take her to the illuminated walks and safety they provide. Rather, he led me into another of the dark alleys instead of the place whither I meant to go, where they shall be least observed. Rather than taking her to the physical, sexual, and social safety of the illuminated walks, Sir Clement takes advantage of the precarious position such darkened pathways create to have a private conversation with Evelina. Forcing a private conversation, which itself could stain a reputation regardless of location. In the notorious dark walks, Sir Clement risks Evelina's safety despite her request to leave. As she observes in a letter to her guardian, to escape Sir Clement, she was forced to speak and in some measure grant the pardon he requested to escape his importunities. Only by acquiescing to Sir Clement's desires, Evelina able to regain her physical movement and escape to the safety of the publicly lit pathways. Yet, such publicly lit pathways do not guarantee safety either. When turning to his description of a fire display gone wrong, Evelina reveals the danger within the anonymity the garden's semi-public nature could create. When Evelina ventures to Vauxhall's rival, Marylebone Garlands, to see a firework display, she and other female patrons are physically moved closer to the fireworks themselves by a male patron. Quote, Mr. Smith proposed the ladies should make interest for a form to stand upon, unquote, while the men should go to different parts of the garden. With Burney emphasizing ladies in the text itself, she asks readers to focus on this gender division, for as the novel quickly reveals, Smith placed women close to the fireworks to make them feel like they were attacked by an explosion of fire. This fear, in turn, makes women run away scared and confused. Drawing upon the ensuing chaos, male guests continually assault Evelina. Quote, every other moment I was spoken to by some bold and unfeeling man, to whom my distress, which I think must be very apparent, only furnished a pretense for impertinent witticisms or free gallantry, unquote. Afforded the opportunity to approach her due to the resulting confusion from the fireworks, men continually take advantage of Evelina's vulnerability. This danger comes to her head when, quote, a young officer marching freely up to me said, "You are a sweet, pretty creature, and I list you in my service." And then, with great violence, he seized my hand, unquote. Alone and isolated from her party, she does not retain her identity as Evelina Anvil, but instead as another pretty creature the officer can take advantage of without consequence. Becoming one of many, she loses the protection of her name and status. It's only when Lord Orville, a friend who can recognize Evelina's name and status, arrives, Evelina is able to escape this series of assaults. Without such a protective male figure, Evelina would have lost reputation through these other male garden goers' manipulation of the garden's structural components. Male garden goers drawing upon the garden's ability to create violence was not a decision of a moment, but was something recognized and expected. Put differently, while one may not know how they would use a pleasure garden to create violence, all knew it was such an allowed behavior. As Mr. Brandbilly comments to Evelina, women who enter the dark walks are seen as encouraging sexual tension. I know that he had to search women within his party. Evelina's cousin claims that if women go into the, quote, long alleys, they must have a mind to be affronted, unquote. For Branton, women must protect themselves, monitoring their own actions. Rather than recognize how women are often escorted into the most dangerous parts of a garden, how other more public parts of the garden transform into sites of danger as well, Branton believes that women must protect themselves. Women must navigate the quick shifts between public and private, moving to whatever part of the garden is safest at the moment. Yet, as Evelina depicts, many other male garden goers also direct their actions and choices around the gardens of violent affordances. Rather than mitigating such affordances, however, they bring them forward. Throughout Evelina, women are consistently treated as lesser, as objects to be played with. The hunting for women in Burney's novel strips away Evelina's selfhood. This talk has argued that during the Romantic century, a woman's reputation was often built around her navigation of sexual violence. Moreover, it has shown how sexual violence was often afforded by garden structure during this period. With garden pathways quickly transforming from public to private, from illuminated to dark, the garden can rapidly change from a place of pleasure to one of pain, forcing women's social identity to be built around such violence. Thank you.